Okay, so before I even start talking about what happened that day, I want you to know something. I want you to know that I debated for almost 3 weeks whether I should even tell this story, whether I should sit down in front of a camera or a page and just say it out loud, just let the words come out of my mouth and admit to the world what I did, what I felt, and what it changed inside me forever. And I kept stopping myself because there was this voice in my head, this really loud, really persistent voice that kept saying nobody is going to understand you. Nobody is going to get it, people are going to laugh, people are going to judge, and you are going to regret the moment you ever opened your mouth. And honestly, for a long time I believed that voice. I let it win. I let it keep me quiet and small and hidden inside this version of myself that I had built very carefully over many years. This version that knew exactly how to walk into a room and smile and say the right things and never ever let anyone see what was actually going on underneath. But something happened recently, something shifted inside me, and I realized that the cost of staying quiet was actually higher than the cost of being seen. And so here I am telling you everything, and I need you to stay with me until the end because this story does not go where you think it goes. It takes turns that I did not expect. And it ends in a place that I genuinely could not have predicted when it all began. So, please just stay with me, okay? Just keep reading, keep listening. Because I promise you that what I am about to share is 100% real and it changed my life in ways I am still trying to fully understand. So let me take you back, let me take you all the way back to the beginning of this, because like all things that matter, the beginning is actually much further back than the day the thing actually happened. The beginning of this story starts when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old and I was at my cousin's house, my older cousin. She was maybe 13 at the time, and she had this room that I was absolutely obsessed with. It was this explosion of color and softness and things that I had never seen in my own room. There were scarves hanging from the mirror frame. There were little bottles of perfume lined up like a tiny city on the dresser. There were clothes draped over the chair in that casual, effortless way that always looked so intentional even when it wasn't. And I remember standing in the doorway of her room while she was downstairs helping my aunt with something. I remember just standing there and feeling this pull. This strange magnetic pull that I did not have a name for. I was just drawn to it, drawn to the softness of it, to the way everything in that room seemed to exist in a totally different emotional register than anything in my own life. And I remember very carefully, very quietly, I walked over to the chair and I picked up one of her scarves. It was silk or something close to silk, deep red with these little gold threads running through it, and I held it in my hands and I felt something that I still cannot fully explain. It was like holding a language I had never learned but somehow recognized. And then I heard footsteps on the stairs and I put it down so fast. I put it down and I stepped back and I told myself that whatever that feeling was, it did not mean anything. It was nothing. I was just curious. Kids are curious. And I walked out of that room and I did not go back and I did not think about it. Or at least I told myself I did not think about it. But the truth is it stayed with me, quiet and small and folded up in some corner of my memory. Waiting. The years went on and I grew up and I became very good at being who everyone expected me to be. I became good at the sports and the rough games and the loud voice and the certain kind of posture and the certain kind of jokes. I became fluent in the language of what I was supposed to be, and I spoke it so well that I even fooled myself sometimes. There were whole seasons of my life where I genuinely thought I had left that moment in my cousin's room behind completely, where I thought whatever that pull was had dissolved on its own, the way feelings sometimes do when you refuse to feed them, and then something would happen, some small random thing, a movie scene, a magazine cover, a song with a particular kind of tenderness in it, and that feeling would surface again, quietly, like something breathing underwater, and I would push it back down and keep moving and keep being who I was supposed to be, and nobody around me ever suspected anything. Nobody ever came close to seeing it, and that was the point. That was the whole project of those years: invisibility, protection, survival through performance. And then came the year everything fell apart, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, and then suddenly in the way that collapses happen. The year I was 22 and living alone for the first time in a small apartment in a city where I did not know very many people, where I had moved for a job that turned out to be nothing like what I expected, where I spent most evenings alone with my thoughts and a television that I kept on mostly for the sound. And it was in that loneliness, in that particular quality of aloneness that only a new city can give you, that things started to shift, that questions I had buried for years started to float up again, not aggressively, not in a way that I could call a crisis, just quietly, persistently surfacing the way they always did. And this time there was nobody around to perform for. This time the audience was gone and it was just me in this small apartment with my own thoughts and nowhere to put them and no one to pretend for, and I started, very slowly, to let myself think. I started reading things online, not looking for anything specific at first, just following a thread of curiosity that I had always cut before it could go anywhere, and I found communities of people who were talking about things that I had never heard talked about out loud before, people who described feelings that sounded so familiar it made my chest hurt, people who talked about this experience of wearing something, of putting on a piece of clothing and feeling like a valve had been opened. Like pressure that had been building for years had somewhere to go, and I read their stories and I felt this complicated mixture of recognition and terror. Recognition because I understood exactly what they were describing, and terror because understanding it meant I could no longer pretend I didn't. I want to tell you about the night it happened because even now, even after everything that came after, that night lives in my memory with this almost surreal vividness. Every detail is preserved like something pressed between glass, and I need to tell it slowly because if I rush through it I will miss the parts that matter, and the parts that matter are not what you think they are. It was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had worked late and I had come home tired in that specific way where your body is heavy but your mind won't stop, and I had eaten something simple standing at the kitchen counter, and I had stood there afterwards in the silence of my apartment and I had felt that pull again, that old familiar pull, and this time instead of pushing it down I just stood there with it, I just let it be there. I looked at it the way you look at something you have been afraid of for a long time when you finally decide to stop running, and I thought to myself, I'm 22 years old and I am alone and nobody is watching and nobody will ever know, and maybe I can just find out what this is, maybe I can just look at it directly instead of through the corner of my eye for the rest of my life. There was a second-hand shop near my apartment that I had walked past dozens of times without going in, one of those shops with everything mixed together on the racks, men's and women's and children's and vintage and contemporary all jumbled up in no particular order, and in the back of my mind I had registered it, I had filed it away under the category of things I noticed but was not allowing myself to think about. And that Tuesday evening, after standing in my kitchen with that feeling, I decided I was going to go, I was going to walk into that shop, and I was going to just see, just look, no commitment, no plan, just look. I cannot tell you how long it took me to actually leave my apartment. I stood at the door with my jacket on for probably 10 minutes. I picked up my keys and put them down twice. I had this whole conversation with myself that was essentially me trying to talk me out of it. This is ridiculous. You are 22 years old. You have a job and a life and people who know you and expect certain things from you. You're not the kind of person who does this. And underneath that there was another voice, quieter but steadier, saying, but what if you are, what if you have always been and you have just been too afraid to find out, and eventually that quieter voice won, not because it was louder but because I was so tired of the performance, I was so tired of carrying something I could not even name, and I opened the door and I walked out into the night. The walk to the shop was 5 minutes but it felt like crossing a border, like the person walking there was moving through territory he had never been allowed to enter and did not quite have papers for, and my heart was doing something that I can only describe as a controlled panic, not quite racing but not steady either, this awareness of my own heartbeat that I do not usually have, and I kept telling myself, just walk in, it is just a shop. You are just a person looking at clothes. There is nothing happening here, nobody is watching, nobody cares. And I pushed open the door and the little bell above it rang and a woman at the counter looked up and smiled and said hello in the completely neutral way that people who work in shops greet strangers, and I smiled back and I stepped inside. I moved through the men's section first. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I spent several minutes moving through it slowly and deliberately in a way that I understood even then was me giving myself permission to be there, establishing my presence as a legitimate customer before I let myself drift toward anything else, and then very casually, the way you do when you are trying not to reveal that a thing matters, I let myself drift toward the other section of the shop, toward the rack of women's blouses and dresses and skirts, and I stood there. And I looked at the clothes on the rack and my hand went out and I touched the sleeve of something. I do not even remember what it was exactly, something soft in a dusty rose color, and that feeling came back, that old feeling from my cousin's room, that sense of a language I recognized without having learned it, and I felt my throat tighten and my eyes get hot and I thought, no, absolutely not. I am not going to cry in a second-hand shop over a blouse. I am not doing that, and I blinked it back and I kept looking. I want to tell you what I chose because the choosing took a long time and it mattered. It felt weirdly important, like this was a decision with weight to it, even though I kept telling myself it was just fabric, just material, just thread and dye in the shape of something. And eventually I found a skirt, a simple navy blue skirt with small white flowers on it, a midi length that fell to the mid-calf, very modest, very quiet. Nothing dramatic about it except that it was the most terrifying thing I had ever considered buying. And I held it on the hanger and I looked at it and I thought about putting it back. I thought about it for a solid 2 minutes, and then I also found a blouse, a cream-colored blouse with small buttons down the front and slightly billowy sleeves, and I held both of them and I told myself this was just an experiment, this was just curiosity, this was just a person finding out something about themselves in the privacy of their own life, and I walked to the counter. And I paid for them, and the woman put them in a bag, and she did not look at me strangely. She did not raise an eyebrow. She just said, "Here you go and have a nice evening," and I said thank you and I walked out. The walk home was completely different from the walk there. On the way there I had been crossing a border with no papers. On the way back I was carrying something in a plastic bag that felt heavier than it weighed, and there was a quality to the air around me that I can only describe as charged, like the atmosphere before lightning. And I walked fast with my head down and my jaw tight, and when I got into my apartment and closed the door behind me I stood in the hallway for a full minute just breathing. I put the bag down on the kitchen table and I looked at it for a long time. I made tea. I do not know why. Making tea felt like a way to give myself time, to let the thing just sit there while I did something normal and ordinary, and I stood at the kettle and I waited and I thought about all the people who knew me, I thought about my family, I thought about my friends, I thought about the version of me that had existed in their understanding for 22 years, and I thought about what it would mean if this turned out to be something real, if this turned out to be something that did not go away when the night was over. And I was not ready for that. I was nowhere near ready for that. So I told myself that this was contained, this was private, this was just for tonight, just to see, just to know, and that whatever happened inside these 4 walls stayed inside these 4 walls. I took my tea and I took the bag into the bedroom and I sat on the edge of the bed and I took the clothes out and laid them on the duvet and I looked at them there, the navy skirt with the white flowers and the cream blouse with the small buttons, and in the light of my bedroom lamp they looked so ordinary, so completely quiet and ordinary, just fabric, just clothes, and I told myself that the way to get through this was just to do it, just to put them on and see what happened and not make it into anything bigger than it was, just a person trying on clothes, just a person looking at something in the mirror, just information, just data about themselves. I changed out of my work clothes slowly, and I picked up the blouse first, and I put it on. And here is where I have to be very careful about how I describe what happened next, because I do not want to exaggerate it and I do not want to minimize it, and I am not sure I have the right words for it even now. But what I will say is that when I put on that blouse and I smoothed it down over my shoulders and I looked at my hands doing that smoothing and I felt the fabric against my skin, something happened that I had not predicted. Something very quiet and very deep. Something that felt less like a revelation and more like a recognition, like a part of me that had been speaking in a foreign language for 22 years had finally heard a word it knew, and I stood there in my bedroom in a cream-colored blouse that I had bought from a second-hand shop on a Tuesday evening, and I felt the very specific sensation of something settling, something that had been vibrating at a low, anxious frequency for most of my life just quietly settling. And I was so surprised by it that I did not move. For a long moment. I put on the skirt. I went to the mirror. And I stood there in front of my own reflection and I looked at myself for a long time, just looked, the way you look at a stranger you are trying to understand, and the person in the mirror was me, clearly me, same face, same eyes, same history, but there was something different, there was something in the posture, something in the quality of the expression, something that I had no word for except to say it felt more honest. It felt like a self I was meeting rather than a self I was maintaining. And I stood there for a very long time and I did not cry. I thought I might, but I did not. I just looked, quietly and seriously, the way you look at something true. I want to tell you what I thought about while I stood there because the thoughts were not what I expected. They were not dramatic. They were not about categories or labels or what any of this meant for my life or my identity or my future. They were small and specific. I thought about my cousin's room and the red silk scarf with the gold threads. I thought about all the years of pushing that pull down and away. I thought about the particular exhaustion of performing yourself for an audience that includes yourself, and I thought about how strange it was that something as simple as the cut of a skirt and the fall of a blouse could function like a key, could open something that years of ignoring had not managed to close. I stayed in those clothes for a long time that night, much longer than I planned. I made more tea and I sat on the couch and I watched something on television and I was just there. I was just present in my own apartment in my own skin in a way that felt different from usual, less armored, less performed, more like actual residing than constant motion. And at some point I fell asleep on the couch and when I woke up it was past midnight and the television was showing something I had not chosen, and I looked down at the skirt and I felt this wave of something complicated, this mixture of peace and terror. Peace because of what the evening had been and terror because of what it might mean, because of the question it had opened rather than closed. I changed back into my own clothes and I folded the skirt and the blouse very carefully and I put them at the back of a shelf in my closet and I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark for a long time and I thought, okay, so now I know, and now what? The now what took a long time to answer. It took months, it took a lot of quiet evenings in that apartment, a lot of careful private exploration, a lot of going back to the second-hand shop and the feeling of something settling when I put on clothes that were not supposed to be mine, a lot of reading other people's words and recognizing myself in them. A lot of sitting with the question of what this meant about who I was without being in any rush to arrive at an answer, because I had learned from years of performance that rushing to an answer is how you end up with the wrong one, and this time I wanted to get it right. This time I wanted to actually know myself rather than know a version of myself I had constructed for someone else's comfort. And slowly over those months, a self started to emerge that felt less like a performance and more like a person, a self that contained both the person I had always known and presented and this other quieter person who had been waiting patiently for a very long time. And I'm not going to tell you it was easy because it was not. I'm not going to tell you there was no fear because the fear was enormous, the fear of what it meant for my relationships, for my family, for the people who had known me one way for 22 years, the fear of a world that I knew was not always kind to people who stepped outside the lines. But I'm going to tell you that the fear, for the first time in my life, was not bigger than the need, and that was new, that was genuinely new. I need to tell you about the first time I told someone because that is its own story. That is the story that runs alongside the story of the clothes and the mirror, the story of what happens when the private thing becomes even slightly less private, when the boundary between the inner life and the outer world gets even the smallest breach, and the person I told was not who you would expect. It was not a close friend or a family member or someone I had known for years. It was a woman I had met at a community garden near my apartment. We had talked maybe 4 or 5 times over the course of a few weeks, always outside, always in the context of the garden. She was maybe 10 years older than me and she had this quality of attention that I have only encountered a few times in my life, this quality of actually listening rather than waiting to speak. And one evening we ended up talking longer than usual and somehow the conversation went to the question of how well we know ourselves, too. The gap between who we present and who we actually are, and I do not know what it was about that evening or that conversation or that particular quality of the light in late autumn, but I told her something, not everything, but something. I said something that gestured toward what I had discovered about myself over those months, and I braced for the response I was afraid of. And she looked at me for a moment and she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that most people spend their whole lives never finding the thing that makes them feel less like they are performing and more like they are actually there, and she said that the ones who do find it are the lucky ones, even when it is complicated, maybe especially when it is complicated, and she said it in such a matter-of-fact way. Such a warm and completely unsurprised way, like I had just told her something ordinary and human and true, and I felt something release in my chest, something I had been holding tightly for a very long time, and we talked for a little longer and then she went home and I walked back to my apartment and I stood at the window for a long time looking at the lights of the city and thinking about luck and about truth and about all the years I had spent trying not to be seen. I'm not going to tell you that everything got simple after that. I'm not going to tell you that one kind conversation in a garden dissolved 22 years of careful hiding, because that is not how it works. It was not linear. It was not a clean arc from confusion to clarity. It was more like a long, slow thaw, patches of ground melting at different rates, some things becoming clear while others stayed frozen. Some relationships getting more honest while others stayed at exactly the distance they had always been, and I am still in that thaw. Even now I am still in it, still finding edges of myself that I have not fully looked at yet, still having days where the old performance impulse rises up and I have to choose, consciously and sometimes with effort, to stay in something more honest instead. But here is what I want to say, here is the thing I want to get to. The reason I am telling this story at all, the thing that felt important enough to make me decide to stop being quiet about it, and it is this. That Tuesday night in my apartment in a city where nobody knew me, standing in front of my mirror in a navy skirt with small white flowers and a cream blouse that I bought at a second-hand shop for almost no money, was not a moment of confusion or mistake or something I needed to recover from. It was a moment of recognition. It was the first time in 22 years that I had stood in front of my own reflection and felt met by the person looking back, and that feeling, that specific feeling of being met by yourself, of the inside and outside being even slightly more aligned than they had ever been, is something I think everyone deserves. I think everyone deserves to find the thing that makes them feel like they are actually there rather than performing being there, and I think the cost of never looking, of spending a lifetime pushing that pull down and away out of fear, is higher than most of us ever calculate because we never add up all the small daily costs, all the energy that goes into maintaining a performance, all the intimacy that never quite happens because there is always something kept back, all the tiredness that does not have an obvious cause. I am not telling you who you are. I am not telling you what your pull means or what your recognition would look like or what it would mean for your life. I am only telling you mine. I am only telling you what happened when I stopped running long enough to look at the thing that had been following me since I was 8 years old in my cousin's room holding a red silk scarf, and what happened was not catastrophe. What happened was more honest than anything that had come before it, and more tender, and more frightening, and more like being alive. And there is one more thing I want to tell you before this is over, and I have been building toward it this whole time because I needed you to know everything else first before this part would make any sense, and it is this. A few months ago I went home to visit my family, first visit in over a year, and I was nervous in the specific way I always get nervous before going home, that old performance anxiety rising up, that sense of putting the armor back on. And my cousin was there, my older cousin, the one with the room I had stood in the doorway of when I was 8 years old, and she is in her 30s now, and we ended up sitting at the kitchen table late at night after everyone else had gone to bed, and we talked, really talked, in a way we never had when we were younger, and at some point she said something that made me go very still. She said, "I used to notice you standing in my doorway when you were little. I always thought you were going to come in but you never did," and she said it so gently, so completely without agenda, and I looked at her across the kitchen table and I thought about the 8-year-old version of me who stood in that doorway and felt something he could not name and could not follow, and I thought about the 22-year-old version of me in a second-hand shop with a navy skirt in his hands, and I thought about all the years between those two moments, and I said I should have come in. And she smiled and she said yes, she said you should have, and there was nothing else in her face, nothing but warmth and the specific kind of recognition that two people share when they have both been keeping something and can finally, just for a moment, put it down. I still have the skirt and the blouse, they are still in my closet, and I wear them sometimes in the evenings in my apartment, and every time I do there is still that feeling, quieter now but still there, that settling, that sense of something more honest, and I have come to understand that this thing is not a problem to be solved or a question to be answered once and for all. It is just a part of who I am, one thread among many in whatever I am, and I am learning, slowly and imperfectly and with a lot of leftover fear, to hold all of it, all of myself, with a little more of the gentleness that 8-year-old me deserved all along. Thank you for staying until the end. I told you it would go somewhere you did not expect. I hope wherever you are right now, whatever you are carrying, whatever pull you have been pushing down and away, I hope you are a little less tired than I was, and if you are not, I hope you find your Tuesday evening, I hope you find your second-hand shop, I hope you find the moment when the quiet voice gets to win, because it has been waiting such a long time, and you deserve, to finally be heard.